Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, as you know from the title, we're going to be talking about my experience interviewing with Meta. I interviewed with them back at the end of 2021 all the way into the beginning of 2022. And during my interview preparation process, I was looking for tons of information on Reddit, Blind, YouTube to try to find some context and details about what the process is like and get some insight from those who had previously went through the process with Meta. And so in this video, I'm going to be talking about kind of how I prepared for the interview, what the interview was structured, how it was structured, and just talking about the results in the interview for those that are interested in interviewing with Meta, or are currently preparing for their interviews with them, or are just kind of curious about the overall process and what that's like and maybe how that differs from other game development companies. So let's jump into it. So I think a big question that kind of comes up immediately is, why did I interview at Meta in the first place? Now, I think this kind of goes back to my philosophy of just interviewing with companies in general all the time whenever an opportunity presents itself, because I think it's really important, especially if you end up wanting to get into FANG at some point, some of these top tech companies, or if you're just interested in keeping your skills fresh like I am. I think whenever an opportunity presents itself, I kind of want to learn as much as I can about some of these other companies, what they're willing to offer in terms of compensation. If you take a look at levels.fyi, it looks like for an E5 role, which is what I was interviewing for, it's a senior software engineer role at Meta. It pays up to around $400,000 per year. So I think it's a good opportunity to just kind of get a sense of what the market is willing to pay you for your skills, and you can use that as leverage in your current role, or just take that how you will. So that's the main reason why I was going into this interview. Now, I won't be sharing any specific details about what questions I was asked, or the specific interviewers or recruiters or any of that nonsense. This is mostly just to be kind of like a high-level overview of what the process was like, and try to give as much detail as I can about how I prepared, what the interviews were like, how they were structured, and all that jazz. So the interview process actually started at the end of 2021. Back in November is when the recruiter reached out to me and wanted to see if I'd be interested in exploring an opportunity at Meta. They thought that I had a really strong background and good experience, and they were interested to kind of chat a little bit more and see where my head was at. So as I mentioned before, I'm always kind of really interested in these opportunities to learn more about the company, learn kind of what opportunities they have, and just kind of improve my skills. So I responded to them, and that's kind of how things got kicked off. After the initial phone screen, the recruiter set me up for a technical phone screen interview, which is just a coding interview. Now, the way the coding interviews work at Meta is that they're generally 2 medium to easy level leak code questions that get asked in like a 45-minute interval. You generally want to spend like 15 to 20 minutes on each question, and then that's kind of how it goes. So I got set up with a technical phone screen in December. After that was successful, they set me up with another technical phone screen in January, and this was kind of the same thing, 2 coding questions, 45-minute round, nothing too crazy. After that, I got really positive feedback from the recruiter, and they decided to move me forward to an on-site interview. Now, this is still kind of during the pandemic, so instead of having a full on-site at their actual office, they decided to just set me up with a virtual on-site interview. And since this is an E5 senior software engineer role, it's a bit more software design heavy, but still has a ton of coding interviews as well. The way it was structured is that there was 1 behavioral interview, 3 coding interviews, and 2 system design interviews. The way I prepared for the coding interviews was primarily through LeetCode. I just spent a couple of hours per day studying the Facebook or Meta LeetCode questions, mostly the easy to medium. Generally, you won't really get asked any hard style questions because they're just too convoluted. They're a bit too complex for a short 45-minute interview. And at Meta, they like to ask 2 coding questions during 1 coding interview, just in case you struggle with the first one or don't quite get it. If you're able to complete the second one successfully, it might give them the signal they need to approve you. So generally, they only ask easy to medium questions, and that's where I primarily spent most of my focus during my studying, just focusing on learning and studying as much of the easy, medium, Facebook tag questions as I possibly could on LeetCode. During the scheduling of the interviews, the recruiters asked me how I wanted to structure things, and I decided to split my interviews up into 2 different days. The first day would include kind of just like a general meet and greet, the behavioral interview, as well as a system design interview, and then the second day day would include the second system design interview and 3 coding interviews. It was going to be really coding heavy on the second day, but I kind of liked that it would be split up so that the system design would be on one day. I wanted to get both system designs on one day and then both coding or all the coding on a different day, but they ended up not having the right resources to get scheduled, so this is as close as they can get it for me. Overall, the format was really nice and simply laid out. There was a break in between, which was good for me to kind of get a chance to get some lunch and stuff like that. Unfortunately, they didn't really offer me any kind of, Uber Eats vouchers or anything like that, which generally if you go for an on-site interview at the actual office, they'll take you to their cafeteria and pay for your lunch and that sort of thing. So I thought it was kind of strange that they didn't give me anything for my lunch. They just gave me a short break where I can go and get my own lunch. So I started the first on-site interview off with the behavioral interview. It was pretty straightforward, like some of the other behavioral interviews you'll see, just kind of like, tell me about a time you struggled, got in a conflict with someone else, tell me about a time where you took initiative, took leadership on a project, tell me about a time where there was some kind of generally those type of behavioral interview questions. So the important thing for behavioral interview questions is to come up with a lot of different stories that you have from your past experiences about projects that you worked on, so that you can kind of just pick and choose one of those that applies to the behavioral question and just insert that right in there. Talk about how that project went, give some insight onto how you would approach that type of problem in the future, and that sort of thing. So the first system design interview was pretty straightforward. It was more game development focused because the role I was interviewing for was in the AR VR space. So we kind of jumped right into the problem. The interview and I got along pretty well. He was also in the game development space. So we talked a little bit about my background and his background, and we kind of shared some fun stories there. Overall, the system design interview was pretty positive. I feel like we got to kind of an optimal solution. We talked about a lot of different components inside the project and how those would be structured and that sort of thing. And overall, he seemed kind of happy with the way I was presenting my ideas. The second on-site interview day started off with another system design interview. This one was a bit more challenging. It wasn't so focused on the game development side of things, but it was more about how you would build kind of a distributed large system. Now, these interviews really like to just get a good understanding of if you know how to build like a really large distributed system. They get a good sense of like if you've worked at a large company and you're aware of how different tech stacks work, how different systems talk to each other, how you would set up kind of like a large scale architecture and that sort of thing. I kind of struggled with this at the beginning, but I feel like towards the end of the interview, we did get a lot of information down about the overall architecture, and I felt somewhat positive moving out of it. Right after the system design interview on the second day, we jumped into 3 different coding interview rounds with a bunch of different interviewers. A lot of these interviews had like a second interviewer, just kind of watching, learning. Maybe they were a newer engineer that joined the team or is ramping up on interviewing people. So they were just kind of watching and observing, but I was mostly engaging with one of the interviewers on the call. Overall, I think the interviews, the coding interviews went pretty positively. I think the biggest thing that you have to remember during the coding interviews is that you really want to make sure that you and your interviewer are on the same page when you're talking about the solution that you want to employ to solve the problem. You never want to jump directly into the code. You mostly just want to ask clarifying questions, talk about some ways that you're thinking about approaching solving the problem, making sure that you and your interviewer are on the same page. They might have some questions about how you would deal with a particular edge case, which might lead you to kind of pivot on the way that you're exploring the solution. But once you and your interviewer are aligned, that's when you kind of get the green light to go ahead and jump into the code and code things up. You want to make sure you leave yourself with enough time to code things and kind of walk through a test case or a few test cases and just talk about the different states of the code, talk about the different states of the variables and what they would be, and actually walk through the actual loops of the code and go through an example. And I think overall, all the interviews, all the coding interviews that I had kind of followed this structure and were pretty positive overall. And I left the interview feeling pretty positive about how things went. About a week after my interview, I got a call from the recruiter saying that they decided to not move forward with me and they decided to go maybe with a different candidate or something. They didn't provide too much details about why they didn't want to move forward. I thought that was kind of strange after about 5 to 6 months of interviewing with them. But generally, this is pretty common in this industry. After you get kind of a rejection, they don't really provide a lot of feedback because there might be like legal concerns and things like that. So I just decided to roll with the punches, and it wasn't too big of a deal. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I wasn't really interested in definitely like pursuing an opportunity with Meta. I was more just interested in learning more about the company, but I did realize that at the time that I was interviewing with Meta, they were kind of changing and pivoting as a company on the direction that they were choosing to go with. And I did notice on Blind that there were a lot of hiring freezes and things like that. So that might have had something to do with why they chose not to move forward with me. But at the end of the day, who really knows? I hope you got a lot of value out of this video. If you did, if you found this video valuable at all from any perspective, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts on what you think, or any thought for future videos as well. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.